The afternoon sun was pouring through the glass walls of my conservatory, catching the steam rising from our teacups. Maya sat across from me. She is 25. Brilliant. And right then, she was crying so hard. Her shoulders were actually shaking. Someone at her architectural firm had just taken her name off a major project proposal. A project she had spent 6 months building from the ground up. They told her she lacked the seniority to present it to the board. They told her she should just be a team player and step aside for the older partners. I handed her a linen napkin. I did not tell her it was going to be okay. I did not offer her a meaningless platitude about hard work paying off in the end. Because at 69 years old, I know the absolute truth about people who take what belongs to you. But before I tell you exactly what I told Maya, take a second and drop a comment to let me know which city or state you are listening from today. I always love reading where this community is tuning in from. Maya wiped her eyes. She looked at me. Her mascara smudged under her lower lashes, and asked why I was not more furious for her. Why I was not telling her to march straight into her director's office and demand her name be put back on that folder. I poured myself another cup of Earl Grey. I just watched the dark amber liquid fill the fine bone china. I took a slow breath. I told her that anger is a very loud, very useless emotion. The people who yell are the people who have no real control. Anger makes you predictable. It makes you sloppy. The truly powerful people do not throw tantrums. They just move a single chess piece. I told her about a time exactly 2 years ago, when someone tried to erase my name from something much more important than a corporate presentation. They tried to erase me from my own family. It was a grand family vacation, a luxury trip to Maui, a trip I was supposed to be a part of, until I found a stack of printed plane tickets resting on my kitchen counter. I flipped through them and realized every single person in my family had a seat on that plane. My daughter, my son-in-law, my 2 grandchildren, everyone, except me. Maya completely stopped crying. She held her teacup with both hands, staring at me in absolute silence. She knows me now as a woman who lives quietly, a retired woman who tends to her orchids and reads. She does not know the woman I used to be before I walked away from my career. I leaned back in my chair. I let the absolute silence stretch between us for just a moment. Listening to the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, I told Maya that when people push you out, you do not push back. You do not scream. You do not beg them to acknowledge your value. You let them walk right out the door. And then, you quietly change the locks on the world they think they own. This is the story of how my son-in-law thought he could cut me out of the picture, entirely unaware that I was the one who owned the canvas he was standing on. I watched Maya process what I had just said. The conservatory was completely quiet, save for the sound of a distant lawnmower and the gentle hum of the climate control system keeping my orchids alive. I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth settle in my chest, and I took her back to the very beginning. I told Maya that to understand how a woman allows herself to be erased, you first have to understand how she built the world she is standing in. I was 29 years old when my husband died. He was a good man, but he left this world unexpectedly, leaving me with a 3-year-old daughter named Clara and exactly $400 to our name. I did not fall apart. I did not have the luxury of falling apart. I had a little girl who needed to eat, who needed a roof, who needed a future. So, I went to work. I started at the front desk of a fading downtown boutique hotel. I worked the graveyard shift. I learned the smell of stale cigarette smoke, cheap coffee, and desperation. But I watched, I listened. I learned how the hospitality machine operated from the inside out. Over the next 40 years, I did not just climb the corporate ladder. I built the ladder myself. I transitioned from that dingy front desk to management, then to regional operations, and eventually, I became one of the most sought-after executive troubleshooters for luxury resorts across the globe. I was the woman they called when a multi-million-dollar property was bleeding money, and nobody knew why. I spent 4 decades learning how the wealthiest people in the world operate. I worked 16-hour days. I walked thousands of miles across imported marble lobbies in shoes that made my feet bleed. I learned to smile pleasantly at men who screamed in my face over a misplaced dinner reservation. I learned that the loudest people in the room are usually the ones drowning in debt. While the people who actually own the building speak so softly, you have to lean in to hear them. And while I was busy fixing broken hotels, Clara was growing up in the back corridors of them. Because I was always working, I brought her with me. My little girl did her middle school homework at empty banquet tables, illuminated by crystal chandeliers. She fell asleep on custom velvet sofas in private VIP lounges. She ate imported caviar from silver room service trays before she even knew how to spell the word. I wanted her to have everything her father could not live. I wanted her to be entirely insulated from the cold, harsh reality of the world I was battling every single day. But I made a critical mistake. I showed her the polished silver, but I never showed her the calloused hands that polished it. When you surround a child with the magnificent end result of grueling labor without ever making them participate in the process, they begin to believe that luxury is a birthright. They stop seeing the invisible work. They only see the gold trim. Clara grew into a beautiful, poised, highly educated woman who expected the world to hand her a warm, lavender-scented towel the moment she stepped out of the rain. She loved me. I truly believe she did. But as she grew older, she began to view me less as a mother and more as the ultimate concierge of her life. I was the person who fixed things. I was the person who funded things. I paid her out-of-state college tuition in cash. I bought her first home outright so she would never have to lose sleep over a mortgage. Our relationship became quietly transactional, and I allowed it to happen out of a deep, lingering guilt for all those school plays I missed because a pipe had burst in the south wing of whatever property I was managing. I told Maya that running a family is remarkably similar to running a 5-star property. You have to maintain the structure. You have to keep the lights on. But most importantly, you have to see the fractures in the foundation long before the walls actually buckle. You have to notice when a Persian rug is fraying at the edges. You have to hear the slight rattle in the ventilation system before the entire thing shuts down in the middle of a heat wave. You have to anticipate disaster. I was a master at anticipating disaster in my career. I could walk into a grand ballroom, glance around for 5 seconds, and tell you exactly which waiter was going to drop a tray. But I was entirely blind to the disaster brewing in my own home. Because Clara was raised in a world of flawless, superficial perfection, she was deeply drawn to men who looked like they belonged in a glossy travel brochure. She did not look for character. She did not look for quiet strength. She looked for a flawless presentation. She wanted someone who looked the part of a wealthy, successful patriarch. Regardless of whether or not the bank accounts actually matched the tailored suits. And that is exactly how a man named Richard walked through the polished doors of our lives, bringing with him the very first crack in my foundation. I watched the steam slowly disappear from Maya's cup. She was listening intently now. The sting of her own workplace betrayal momentarily pushed aside by the memory I was unfolding. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the smooth oak of the table. I told her about the day Clara brought Richard home. Richard was 32 years old, a junior finance director at a mid-tier wealth management firm. But if you listened to him speak for more than 5 minutes, you would swear he was single-handedly keeping the global economy afloat. He was a man constructed entirely out of external validation. He wore custom-tailored suits that I knew just by the way he panicked when he spilled a drop of water on the lapel. Were bought on high-interest credit. He drove a pristine European sports sedan, but I had seen the way his jaw tightened when the valet at a restaurant asked for a $20 tip. He was terrified of being perceived as ordinary bide. He was drowning in his own desperate need to look wealthy. And from the very first day we met, Richard deeply resented me. He did not resent me because I was unkind to him. He resented me because I did not fit into the glossy country club narrative he was desperately trying to build for his life. By the time Clara married him, I had already quietly stepped down from my executive roles. I had traded my tailored blazers for comfortable cashmere sweaters. I drove a reliable 8-year-old sedan. I lived in a beautiful but incredibly unassuming home, tending to my garden and reading historical biographies. Richard looked at me and saw a quaint, slightly embarrassing relic. He had no idea that I owned the house in cash. He had no idea about the blind trusts, the diversified portfolios, or the quiet investments I held. He just saw an older woman who preferred loose tea to expensive whiskey, and he immediately categorized me as someone beneath his notice. The microaggressions started small. He would invite Clara and me to dinner and then loudly complain to the sommelier about the wine I had politely chosen, overriding my order to select something 3 times the price just to prove he could. He would make offhand comments about my neighborhood, suggesting I should move into a gated community for people my age, as if I were a fragile bird that needed to be caged away from his vibrant, successful life. But it was last November, during Thanksgiving dinner, when the first real fracture happened. Clara and Richard were hosting the holiday at their new Praeden and Newbine, heavily mortgaged home. Richard had insisted on inviting 3 senior partners from his firm. He was desperate for a promotion, and he wanted to show these men that he belonged in their inner circle. The dining room was a stage set. The table was covered in heavy silver chargers and imported crystal. Richard was pacing around the room in a charcoal vest, pouring a tremendously expensive Cabernet and laughing just a little too loudly at every joke the partners made. I was in the kitchen. Richard had fired the private chef that morning over a disagreement about the menu, and Clara was on the verge of a panic attack trying to manage a 20-pound turkey and 4 side dishes. So, I stepped in. I rolled up my sleeves, put on an apron, and calmly saved the dinner. When the food was finally ready, I carried a heavy, polished silver tray of roasted vegetables out to the dining room. I set it down gently on the sideboard. One of the senior partners, a kind-looking man named David, smiled at me. He told Richard that the spread looked absolutely magnificent and complimented my hard work. Richard stopped laughing. He looked at me, standing there in my simple wool sweater and an apron, holding a silver serving tong. A look of sheer embarrassment flashed across his face. He took a slow sip of his wine, looked right at David, and let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. He said, "Oh, don't encourage her, David. Josephine used to work in the hotel industry. She has a bit of a complex about hospitality. She just can't help playing the maid, even when she's supposed to be a guest." The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. You could hear the heavy tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. David looked incredibly uncomfortable, staring down at his napkin. I looked at Clara. My beautiful, highly educated daughter simply looked down at her plate. She did not say a word. She chose the silence. She chose his facade over my dignity. I did not drop the tray. I did not raise my voice. I did not remind Richard that the luxury properties I used to manage generated more revenue in a single weekend than his entire firm did in a fiscal quarter. I did not tell him that I had fired men twice his age and 10 times his net worth for speaking to my staff the way he had just spoken to me. I simply took off the apron. I folded it into a perfect, precise square, laid it next to the tray, and looked at him. I gave him a long W. Unbroken. 3-second stare. I looked right through the custom suit, right through the expensive watch, straight into the terrifying insecurity that ruled his miserable life. Then, I quietly walked out the back door and drove home. But as I walked away, I saw Richard out of the corner of my eye. I saw him visibly relax. He puffed his chest out just a fraction of an inch. He adjusted his silver tie clip and offered David another glass of wine with a Smug's 20. Satisfied little smirk on his face. He mistook my silence for surrender. He truly believed, with the arrogant certainty of a very small man, that he had won. He thought he had successfully put his embarrassing mother-in-law in her place in front of his bosses. He had no idea that all he had really done was hand me the exact blueprint of how to break him. That Thanksgiving was the first real fracture, but the actual trap was something Richard built with his own 2 hands. He built it about 4 months later, right at the beginning of spring. Inside their overly decorated living room. I remember that Sunday evening clearly. I was sitting on their beige linen sofa. Clara was in the kitchen, nervously preparing a charcuterie board, trying to make everything look effortless. But the air in the house was incredibly thick. You could smell the expensive lavender candles she was burning, trying to mask the scent of pure, unadulterated financial panic. Richard, however, was in a completely different world. He was buzzing with a manic, almost aggressive kind of energy. He was pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor, a glass of bourbon in his hand, the ice clinking loudly every time he gestured. He waited until Clara brought the food out and sat down next to me. Then, with the dramatic flair of a man unveiling a masterpiece, he reached into his suit jacket and tossed a thick, glossy brochure onto the coffee table. It landed with a heavy, expensive thud. I looked down. The cover featured a sweeping, drone-shot view of pristine white sand, dramatic black volcanic rocks, and a massive, sprawling luxury complex built right into the cliffs. Across the top, in elegant gold foil lettering, it read, Opal Coast Resort, Maui. We are going to Hawaii. Richard announced. His voice was entirely too loud for the small room. Clara gasped. She picked up the brochure, her eyes widening at the pictures of the infinity pools and the private cabanas. Richard, this looks incredible. But how? This place is... She trailed off, probably remembering the massive mortgage payment they had barely made 2 weeks prior. Richard waved his hand dismissively, taking a sip of his bourbon. Don't worry about the logistics. Clara, that is what I do. I make things happen. He leaned against the mantelpiece, looking down at us with a smug, satisfied grin. He proceeded to deliver a 10-minute monologue about how he had single-handedly secured this reservation. He claimed he had to call in massive favors. He bragged about his elite status with some travel agency, boasting that the general public could not even get a phone call returned from a place like this during peak season. But then, he revealed the real reason for the trip, the desperate, pathetic truth behind the glossy paper. The senior partners from my firm are having their executive retreat there the same week, Richard said, a terrifying gleam of ambition in his eyes. David and the other managing directors, they are renting out the East Wing. I figured, What better way to show them I am partner material than to casually bump into them at the valet? To show them I run in the same circles, you have to spend money to make money. Clara, you have to look the part. He was not taking his family on a vacation. He was staging a high-stakes theatrical performance. He was going to drag his wife and 2 young children across the Pacific Ocean, likely putting tens of thousands of dollars on high-interest credit cards, just to orchestrate a fake casual encounter by a hotel swimming pool to impress men who barely knew his last name. We are all going down, Richard declared, opening his arms wide. He looked directly at me. Even you. Josephine, we are taking the whole family. The kids need to see what real success looks like. And honestly, it will be good for you to get out of that quiet little house of yours and see how the other half lives. He smiled a benevolent, condescending smile. He wanted me there as an audience member. He wanted the woman he considered a quaint, embarrassing former maid to watch him ascend to the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. I did not point out the sheer insanity of his plan. I did not ask him what the interest rate was on the card he used to book the flights. I did not mention that the men he was trying to impress would immediately see through a junior director casually stalking them at their private retreat. I just looked down at the brochure on the table. Opal Coast Resort. I reached out and ran my fingers over the gold foil lettering. I felt a very slow, very cold realization wash over me. The universe has a strange sense of humor. Maya, out of all the islands in the world, out of all the luxury properties scattered across the Pacific, Richard had chosen that specific one to build his house of cards. He thought he was introducing me to a world I could not possibly comprehend. He had absolutely no idea that 15 years ago, I was the executive consultant hired to completely restructure the management operations of the entire Opal Coast brand. He had no idea that I knew the exact layout of that property, from the presidential suites down to the underground laundry facilities. He did not know that I had personally fired their incompetent general manager in that very lobby, or that the current regional director of the entire island chain was a man I had trained from the ground up. Richard stood there, swirling his expensive bourbon. Believing he was the undisputed king of the room, he thought he was holding all the cards. I looked up at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not challenge him. I simply offered him a warm pleasant smile. It sounds like a truly unforgettable trip. Richard, I said softly, thank you for including me. His chest puffed out just a fraction more. He took another sip of his drink, completely blind to the fact that he had just walked right into the center of the web, handed me the thread, and asked me to pull it. I looked at that glossy brochure on Clara's coffee table, listening to the ice clink in Richard's glass as he paced the room, completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He was telling Clara about the strings he had pulled. He was bragging about the travel agent he had practically bullied into securing this reservation. He was painting a picture of himself as a master of the universe, a man who could snap his fingers and make doors open at one of the most exclusive properties in the Pacific. And I just sat there, listening to him. I did not laugh. I did not roll my eyes. I simply let him enjoy the sound of his own voice. Because what Richard did not know, what he could not possibly fathom in his incredibly narrow view of the world, was the reality of what the Opal Coast Resort actually was to me. 15 years ago, long before Richard ever bought his first oversized suit, Opal Coast was bleeding money. It was a stunning property, built on pristine black volcanic rock. But the management was a complete and absolute disaster. The service was sloppy. The turnover was high. The ultra-wealthy guests they were trying to attract were leaving after 2 days and never coming back. The holding company that owned the resort panicked. They needed someone who could walk in, rip the foundation down to the studs, and rebuild the hospitality culture from the ground up. They called me. I spent 8 months living on that island. I walked every single inch of that property. I redesigned their staff training protocols. I restructured their entire VIP concierge system. I fired the general manager right in the middle of the grand lobby because he spoke to a housekeeper like she was dirt on his shoe. I did not just work at Opal Coast. I breathed life back into it. And when I left, the board of directors gave me something very few people in the world possess: a lifetime executive designation, a permanent, silent red flag in their global system attached to my name, ensuring that any property I ever visited would treat me as if I owned the building. But there was something else. Richard did not know. During my time there, I took a young, incredibly sharp assistant manager under my wing. His name was Marcus. He was brilliant, hardworking, but he was constantly being overlooked by the older, lazier executives. I saw his potential. I mentored him. I taught him how to read a room, how to anticipate a crisis, and how to command respect without ever raising his voice. Today, Marcus is not an assistant manager. He is the regional director of operations for the entire Hawaiian island chain. He answers only to the board, and I had spoken to Marcus exactly 1 month before Richard threw that brochure on the coffee table. Clara had mentioned the Hawaii trip to me in passing weeks earlier. She was stressed. She was exhausted. I could see the dark circles under my daughter's eyes. The quiet panic of a woman trying to hold together a lifestyle they could not actually afford. I knew Richard had booked the absolute cheapest room available on the property. A standard double bed on the ground floor, facing the employee parking lot. That was all his maxed-out credit cards could handle. I did not want my grandchildren spending a week looking at a concrete wall. I did not want Clara stressing over the price of a club sandwich. So, I waited until Clara left my house that day. I went into my study, and I made a quiet phone call. Marcus answered on the second ring. He was thrilled to hear my voice. I asked him to pull up Richard's reservation. I gave him my son-in-law's name. And I asked for a favor. I told Marcus to upgrade the booking, not to a suite, not to an ocean view. I told him to apply my executive privilege and move my family into the presidential villa, the 3-bedroom cliffside estate with the private infinity pool and the dedicated butler. I told him to flag the file for full complimentary status, private dining, priority cabanas, unrestricted access to the VIP lounges. I wanted Clara to feel like a queen for 7 days. I wanted my grandchildren to have absolute magic. And the most important instruction I gave Marcus was this: make it look like a system upgrade. Do not put my name on the welcome card. Do not tell Richard I paid for it. Let Richard believe that his travel agent pulled a miracle, or that the hotel recognized his status from his firm. Let him have the glory. I did not need the credit. I just wanted my family to be taken care of. That was the reality of the situation. As I sat on that beige sofa, Richard was standing right in front of me, taking a sip of his expensive bourbon, looking down his nose at me. He was telling me that I needed to get out of my quiet little house to see how the other half lived. He was bringing me along to be a spectator to his greatness. He was standing on a stage I had built, basking in a spotlight I had personally paid for. And he was using it to try and make me feel small. I looked at him. I looked at the smug, arrogant twist of his mouth. I could have destroyed him right then and there. I could have calmly explained exactly why he was getting that villa. I could have watched his ego shatter into 1,000 tiny pieces on his expensive hardwood floor, but I didn't. Because a truly powerful person knows that the best time to let a man realize he is standing on a trapdoor is not when he is safely on the ground. You let him climb all the way to the very top of the ladder first. I am so looking forward to it." "Richard," I told him, keeping my voice soft and entirely pleasant, "it sounds like you have thought of absolutely everything." He smiled. He truly believed he had won. He had no idea the game had not even started yet. It was exactly 2 weeks before the departure date, a quiet, heavily overcast Tuesday afternoon. Clara had stopped by my house after she picked the children up from school. The kids were in the living room, watching television. While Clara came into the kitchen, I was standing by the stove, waiting for the kettle to boil. From the moment she walked through my front door, I knew something was wrong. You learn to read the micro-expressions of people when you spend 40 years managing hospitality crises. You learn to spot the slight tightening of a jaw, the unnatural pitch of a voice, the way someone avoids making direct eye contact. Clara was buzzing with a frantic, nervous energy. Her voice was just a little too high. Her smiles were just a little too forced. She walked over to my kitchen island and set down a thick, heavy manila envelope. She patted it twice with her hand. A nervous little gesture. She told me those were the final travel documents for the Hawaii trip. She said Richard was old-fashioned and insisted on having physical copies of everything printed out, just in case his phone died at the airport. Then, she looked at her watch, entirely too dramatically, and said she needed to step outside to take a quick call from a client. She practically sprinted out the back door, leaving me alone in the kitchen. The house was incredibly quiet. The only sound was the soft, low hum of the refrigerator and the gentle drumming of the rain against the glass of the bay window. I looked at the manila envelope sitting on my polished granite counter. I walked over to it. I untied the small string holding the flap closed. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of glossy paper. The scent of fresh printer ink hit the air. I flipped past the hotel brochures. I flipped past the rental car agreements. I found the airline confirmation pages. They were stapled together in the top left corner. I looked at the first page. There was the airline logo. There was the flight number. And there, printed in bold, black ink, was Richard's name, a first-class upgrade. I noted that with a quiet sense of amusement, knowing he had probably drained a credit card just to avoid sitting with the general public. I flipped to the second page, Clara's name. Also in first class, I flipped to the third and fourth pages. My 2 beautiful grandchildren, sitting in the premium economy section right behind their parents. I took a slow breath. I flipped to the 5th page. There was no 5th page. There was only a receipt for the baggage fees. I stopped. I turned the stack of papers over, thinking perhaps my ticket had been printed on the back. It had not. I looked inside the manila envelope again, holding it open to the light. It was completely empty. I took the 4 printed tickets and laid them out side by side on the kitchen counter. 4 tickets, 4 seats, 4 people. The silence in my kitchen suddenly felt incredibly heavy. It pressed against my ears. I stood there, looking down at the names of my family, and I felt a very slow, very cold realization wash over me. Richard had stood in his living room weeks earlier, swirling his expensive bourbon, looking me right in the eye, and told me I was coming with them. He had made a grand parted, sweeping show of inviting me. He wanted me to pack a suitcase. He wanted me to clear my schedule. He wanted me to anticipate walking through those resort doors. But he never had any intention of buying me a ticket. The invitation was not real. It was a performance. It was a calculated, deliberate weapon designed to make me feel small. He wanted the absolute satisfaction of waiting until the very last possible minute to cut me out. He wanted to leave me standing in my driveway with a packed bag, watching his luxury sedan pull away without me. He wanted to prove that he was the gatekeeper of my daughter, of my grandchildren, of my access to the world. And Clara knew. My brilliant, beautiful daughter, whose college tuition I had paid in cash so she would never know the weight of a student loan. The daughter whose first house I bought outright. The daughter I had shielded from every harsh reality of the world. She had sat on that beige sofa, listening to her husband invite me on a trip she knew I was never going to take. And she had walked into my kitchen today, carrying the physical proof of my exclusion, and ran outside because she was too much of a coward to look me in the eye when I found it. I looked down at the tickets again. I traced my thumb over the edge of the paper. I did not cry. I did not feel the sudden, hot rush of anger. I did not want to scream. What I felt was something much deeper. It was a profound, absolute stillness. It was the sensation of watching a bridge burn and realizing you do not care about the ashes because you own the land on both sides of the river. I thought about the phone call I had made to Marcus. I thought about the presidential villa waiting for them, the private infinity pool, the dedicated butler, the absolute pinnacle of luxury that I had quietly, anonymously arranged for them under my own executive privilege. They were erasing my name from their vacation. They were crossing me out of their family portrait. They had absolutely no idea that they were about to board a plane and fly halfway across the Pacific Ocean to land squarely inside a kingdom where my name was the only currency that mattered. I heard the back door handle turn. Clara was coming back inside. I did not scramble to put the papers away. I did not hide the envelope. I simply gathered the 4 tickets, tapped the bottom edges against the granite counter to align them perfectly, and waited for my daughter to walk into the room. The back door creaked open. Clara stepped back into the kitchen, bringing the smell of damp earth and spring rain with her. She brushed a wet strand of hair behind her ear. She looked everywhere except at the polished granite counter. She looked at the stove, at the refrigerator, at the floor. I just stood there. I had aligned the 4 printed tickets in a perfect, straight row. Clara finally forced herself to look at them. I watched her throat swallow hard. She took a step forward, her hands nervously twisting the strap of her expensive leather purse. She opened her mouth to speak. But before she could get a single word out, the heavy sound of a car door slamming echoed from the driveway. It was Richard. He had just gotten off work. I heard his heavy, confident footsteps on the porch before he pushed the door open. He was wearing a navy blue tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase, looking every inch the successful finance director he desperately wanted the world to believe he was. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Clara, who was pale and visibly shaking, and then he looked at me. Finally, his eyes landed on the 4 tickets laid out on the counter. He did not look guilty. He did not look ashamed. He actually smiled. "Ah," Richard said, setting his briefcase down on the floor. His voice was smooth, practiced, like he was closing a minor business deal. "I see you found the itinerary." "Josephine." Clara jumped in, her voice pitched high with fake desperate concern. "Mom? We were going to tell you tonight. We really were. It is just that we started thinking about the logistics. Maui is so far away. It is a 14-hour flight. The time difference is brutal. We just kept thinking about your health. We did not want to put you through all that stress. It is so much better for you to just stay here and rest." I listened to my daughter. I looked into the eyes of the little girl I had carried through empty hotel ballrooms. The girl whose entire life was built on the foundation of my exhausting, invisible labor. She was standing in my kitchen, wearing a cashmere coat I had bought her for Christmas, lying straight to my face to protect the fragile ego of her husband. I have spent 40 years in corporate boardrooms. I have negotiated multi-million-dollar severance packages. I know what a lie sounds like. I know the exact cadence of a person who is trying to sell you a bridge to nowhere. I did not interrupt her. I let her finish painting her pathetic little masterpiece of a lie. When she finally stopped talking, the kitchen was dead silent. Richard stepped forward, placing a heavy, patronizing hand on Clara's shoulder. He looked at me with a gaze so incredibly condescending, it almost took my breath away. Clara is absolutely right. Josephine, Richard said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. A trip of this magnitude to a property like Opal Coast. It requires a certain kind of stamina. It is a very fast-paced, high-end environment. You would just be exhausted trying to keep up with us. We want you to be comfortable. Next time, maybe in the fall, we will take you somewhere much closer, somewhere quiet. Maybe we can drive down to the city and visit that history museum you like so much. He was talking to me like I was a fragile, slightly confused child. He was offering me a trip to a local museum as a consolation prize for being erased from my own family. I looked at the heavy silver watch on his left wrist. I knew for a fact he was still paying it off. I looked at the smug, arrogant twist of his lips. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for me to cry, to beg, to scream about how unfair it was. He wanted the drama because the drama would prove that he had power over me. He wanted to watch me break. I did not raise my voice. I did not point a finger at him. I did not remind him that I had spent half my life running properties that would not even let a man like him pass the security gate without a prior reservation. I simply looked down at the 4 tickets. Then, I looked back up at Richard, and I offered him a warm, soft, completely serene smile. You know what? Richard, I said, my voice perfectly steady. You are absolutely right. A trip like that certainly does require a specific kind of stamina, and I think staying here in the quiet is exactly what I need. You all go. Have a wonderful time. The change in the room was instantaneous. Clara let out a massive, audible breath, her shoulders sagging with sheer relief. But Richard was a picture of pure, unadulterated triumph. I watched his chest physically expand. I watched the tension melt out of his jaw. He mistook my silence for surrender. He truly believed, with the absolute, arrogant certainty of a man who has never actually been in a real fight, that he had won. He thought he had successfully put the old woman in her place, without a single drop of blood being spilled. He gave me a magnanimous nod, like a king granting a pardon to a peasant. I am glad you understand. Josephine, it really is for the best. He picked up his briefcase, wrapped his arm around my daughter's waist, and guided her out of the kitchen to gather the children from the living room. They walked out of my house, got into their expensive European sedan, and drove away, leaving me alone in the quiet. They thought they had left me behind. They thought they had secured their perfect, flawless victory. They had absolutely no idea that I had not surrendered. I had simply stepped out of the way, so that when they finally walked off the edge of the cliff, there would be absolutely nothing for them to hold on to. I stopped talking for a moment. The conservatory was warm, filled with the soft afternoon sunlight and the scent of damp earth from my orchids. But the memory of that cold, rainy kitchen still hung heavily in the air between us. Maya was staring at me, her mouth slightly open, and then a sudden, hot rush of anger took over her face. She slammed her hand down on the small oak table between us. She hit it so hard that her teacup tipped completely over. Dark amber liquid spilled across the polished wood, dripping down onto the woven rug. Maya gasped. She immediately started apologizing, her hands shaking as she frantically looked around for a napkin. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached over, took a thick white linen cloth from the tray, and calmly laid it over the spill. I pressed my hand down, watching the fabric absorb the mess, bringing the table back to a state of complete order. "I cannot believe you did that," Maya said, her voice vibrating with secondhand rage. "I cannot believe you just let them walk out the door. Why didn't you scream at him? Why didn't you tell him right then and there that you were the one who got him that villa? You should have taken those tickets, ripped them into 100 pieces, and thrown them right in his smug face." I finished wiping the table. I folded the damp cloth into a neat, precise square and set it aside. I looked at Maya. Her cheeks were flushed. She wanted the drama. She wanted the immediate, explosive satisfaction of a screaming match. It is a very natural, very young reaction to being deeply disrespected. I told her what I am telling you now. If I had screamed, if I had ripped up those tickets, what would have happened? Richard would have immediately gone into defense mode. He would have turned the situation around. He would have told Clara that I was becoming emotionally unstable in my old age. He would have told his business partners that his mother-in-law had a hysterical mental breakdown. He would have played the absolute victim. When you scream, you hand the other person a shield. You give them a convenient excuse to label you as the problem. In my 40 years of running luxury hotels, I learned a fundamental truth about human nature. The guest who stands in the lobby and screams at the front desk staff about a slightly cold steak is almost always a person deeply insecure about their own status. They are loud because they have no real authority. But the truly powerful guests, the ones who can actually buy the entire building, they never shout. If they receive unacceptable service, they do not cause a scene. They simply walk away, make one quiet phone call to the board of directors, and the general manager is quietly replaced by the following morning. True power is entirely silent. Anger, loud and explosive anger, is the weapon of the powerless. Maya listened to me. The anger slowly started to drain from her face, replaced by a quiet, dawning comprehension. But her eyes still held a deep sadness. She looked down at her empty teacup and asked me if it hurt. She asked if it broke my heart that Clara, my own daughter, went along with the lie. I took a slow sip of my tea. Yes, I told her. That was the only part of that afternoon that truly cut me. But I realized, standing in that kitchen, that my daughter was a hostage to her own fragile lifestyle. She was terrified of losing the facade of success. She chose a lie over her mother because the lie was the only thing keeping her marriage from collapsing under the massive weight of its own debt. I could not save Clara by yelling at her. I could only save her by letting the entire fake world she was clinging to burn completely to the ground, so she could finally see what it was made of. I told Maya that true retaliation requires a very cold, very clear head. You cannot execute a flawless strategy while your hands are shaking with rage. I needed Richard to feel completely, absolutely secure. I needed him to pack his expensive linen suits. I needed him to load his family into his car and drive to the airport believing he was the smartest, most untouchable man in the world. Because a trap is only effective if the prey walks into it willingly. Whistling a happy tune, I poured Maya another cup of tea. I watched her shoulders finally relax. She was no longer crying over her own stolen project at work. She was fully immersed in the lesson I was handing her. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, and I told her exactly what I did. The moment Richard's European sedan disappeared down my street, leaving me alone in my quiet house. It was exactly 11:45 at night when I finally walked into my study. The rain had not stopped since Clara and Richard left my kitchen that afternoon. The entire house was wrapped in that deep, heavy quiet that only happens in the middle of a storm. I did not go to bed. I did not even bother changing into my nightgown. I simply walked over to my heavy mahogany desk, turned on the small brass reading lamp, and sat down in the leather chair. I looked at Maya. I told her that when you spend your entire life managing luxury hotels, you learn that every single problem in the world can be solved if you just have access to the right system. You do not need to yell. You do not need to throw a fit. You just need to know which button to push to turn the lights off. I opened my laptop, but I did not need to look up any phone numbers. I reached for my desk phone and dialed a private, unlisted international line, a line that bypassed the front desk, bypassed the VIP concierge, and rang directly in the private office of the regional director of operations for the Hawaiian Island chain, because hospitality never sleeps. I knew he would still be awake. The phone rang twice. Then, a deep, calm, incredibly professional voice came through the speaker. "Marcus speaking," he said. "Good evening." "Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I hope I am not interrupting your end-of-month reporting." There was a half-second pause on the line, and then I heard the immediate, genuine warmth flood his voice. "Mrs. Pemberley, it is an absolute honor. You could call me at 3 in the morning, and it would not be an interruption. Please, tell me, how can I help you? Is everything all right with the family reservation for next week?" I leaned back in my chair. I looked at the rain beating against the dark window pane. I told Marcus that there had been a slight change of plans. I asked him if he was sitting at his computer. He said he was. I asked him to pull up the reservation under Richard's name. I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on his end of the line, followed by the soft hum of the resort server loading the file. "I have it right here." "Mrs. Pemberley," Marcus said, "the presidential villa. Executive complimentary status applied across all food and beverage outlets. Priority cabana access. Dedicated butler service. All flagged under your lifetime executive privilege, just as you requested last month." I took a slow, deep breath. The scent of old paper and polished wood in my study suddenly felt incredibly grounding. "Marcus," I said softly, "I want you to look past my executive override. I want you to dig down into the original booking. I want you to tell me exactly what my son-in-law actually paid for when he secured this reservation." There was silence on the line for a few seconds. Just the sound of more typing. And then Marcus let out a very quiet, very dry chuckle. "Well," Marcus said, his professional tone dropping just a fraction to speak to me as a former mentor. "This is interesting. He did not book through our corporate travel portal. He did not even book through a premium travel agent. He used a third-party discount website, a clearance site for unsold inventory." I closed my eyes for a moment. "Read it to me." "Marcus, exactly what did he buy?" "He booked a standard double room in the East Wing." Marcus read off the screen. "Ground floor. That specific block of rooms faces the employee parking structure and the commercial laundry exhaust vents. It is the cheapest square footage on the entire property. He paid a heavily restricted /Aries. Non-refundable promotional rate. No breakfast included. No resort credit. No pool access privileges beyond the public family area." I just sat there in the dim light of my study, listening to the absolute, pathetic reality of my son-in-law's grand illusion. Richard had stood in my living room, wearing a custom suit he probably could not afford. swirling his expensive bourbon, and bragging about his elite status. He had talked down to me. He had treated me like a peasant who should be grateful just to witness his magnificent, wealthy lifestyle. He had told Clara that he was pulling strings to secure a luxury experience to impress the senior partners at his firm. But the truth was, he had bought a discount ticket to a concrete wall. Every single ounce of glory, every bit of luxury he was banking on to elevate his status, was entirely, 100% funded by the silent grace of the woman he had just deliberately left behind. He was a man standing in a cardboard box, utterly convinced he was living in a castle, simply because I had painted the walls gold for him. Maya was leaning entirely across the small oak table now. Completely captivated, she asked me what I did next. She asked if I told Marcus to cancel the entire reservation and leave them stranded. I smiled. A small, cold smile. I told Maya that canceling the reservation would have been too easy. If I canceled it, Richard would have received an email. He would have had time to panic, to come up with a lie, to blame a system glitch, or to cancel the trip altogether and play the victim. He would have saved face. You never warn a man who is actively trying to destroy you. You do not send him an email telling him the bridge is out. You let him pack his bags. You let him get in his car. You let him drive all the way to the airport, board the plane, and fly over the ocean. You let him walk right up to the edge of the cliff, completely blinded by his own arrogance. I looked at the phone in my hand. I listened to the steady breathing of my former protégé on the other end of the line, waiting for my command. "Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet of my study with absolute, unassailable finality. "I need you to execute a system update on that file." I sat in my dim study, listening to the rain hit the glass, and I gave Marcus the exact instructions to dismantle my son-in-law's entire fake reality. I told him not to cancel the reservation. I made that very clear. "If you cancel it, Marcus," I explained, keeping my voice perfectly calm, "the automated system will send an email to his phone. He will have time to call the airline. He will have time to make up a story about a booking error, or blame his travel agent, or simply tell his business partners that he decided to take his family to Europe instead. I do not want him to have an excuse. I want you to perform a hard reset on the file." I heard Marcus shift in his leather chair on the other end of the line. The clicking of his keyboard stopped for a fraction of a second. Then, it started again. Faster this time. "A hard reset," Marcus repeated, his professional tone laced with a quiet, deep understanding. "You want me to completely strip the executive override." "Exactly," I said. "Remove the VIP flag entirely. Detach my name and my lifetime status from his profile. Release the presidential villa back into the general booking inventory. Cancel the dedicated butler service. Revoke the priority check-in status. Remove the complimentary food and beverage tags. I want every single comped service entirely wiped from the system." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the heavy mahogany desk. "I want Richard to receive exactly what he actually paid for." I told him, nothing more, nothing less. Marcus was silent for a moment, just the rapid sound of his typing echoing over the private line. "It is done, Mrs. Pemberley," Marcus finally said. "The file is completely stripped. He is locked into the standard double room in the East Wing. Ground floor. No breakfast included. No access to the private infinity pools. He does not have an airport transfer arranged anymore, which means he will have to take a standard public taxi from the terminal, and because the VIP flag is gone, He will have to stand in the general public queue at the front desk when he arrives. I thanked Marcus. I wished him a good night. And I hung up the phone. I looked at Maya across the small oak table in my conservatory. The storm outside had passed long ago. But the memory of that phone call still felt incredibly crisp in the air. Maya was sitting perfectly still, her hands wrapped around her teacup. A slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. She understood the absolute surgical precision of what I had just done. I did not take anything away from Richard that belonged to him. I simply took back what belonged to me. I pulled the invisible safety net out from under him, leaving him suspended in midair, completely unaware that gravity was about to take over. I told Maya that the absolute best part of the trap was watching him spend the next 14 days dancing right on the edge of it. The 2 weeks leading up to the departure date were a masterclass in false triumph. Richard was practically glowing with arrogance. He truly believed he had successfully pushed me out of the picture without a single consequence. He came over to my house 3 days before the flight to drop off a spare set of house keys. He was wearing a brand new, expensive white linen shirt. I knew he had bought an entirely new vacation wardrobe. Putting thousands of dollars on credit cards he could barely afford to pay the minimum balances on. He walked into my living room, jingling his keys, looking around my quiet, unassuming house with a look of profound pity. "We are really going to miss you, Josephine," Richard said, his voice dripping with that fake, overly loud sympathy. "But Clara and I were just talking about it last night. We really feel good about this decision. The itinerary I put together is just packed private cabanas, 5-star dinners with the senior partners from my firm. You would absolutely hate the pace of it." He patted his leather briefcase, where I knew he kept his carefully printed, color-coded schedule. A schedule built entirely around the complimentary access and VIP reservations that had already been permanently erased from the hotel server thousands of miles away. I just smiled at him. I offered him a cup of coffee. I asked him if he had remembered to pack enough sunscreen. I watched him stand in my home, inflating his chest, bragging about a world he thought he owned. He was a man walking onto a battlefield with a wooden sword, absolutely convinced he was a king. He had no idea that when he landed in Maui, there would be no black car waiting for him on the tarmac. He had no idea he was going to have to drag his exhausted family and his expensive new luggage to a public taxi stand. He had no idea he was going to walk into one of the most exclusive lobbies in the world, trying to casually impress his wealthy bosses, only to be handed the key to a ground-floor room facing a concrete wall. "Have a safe flight, Richard," I told him as he walked out my front door for the last time before the trip. "I hope the resort is everything you expect it to be." He gave me one last, incredibly arrogant smirk. "Oh, it will be, Josephine," he said confidently. "I always make sure I get exactly what I deserve." I watched his car back out of my driveway. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I completely agreed with him. He was about to get exactly what he deserved. The morning of the flight was a crisp, perfectly clear Thursday. I woke up at 5 in the morning, made myself a travel mug of hot black coffee, and drove over to their house. I wanted to hug my grandchildren before they left for the airport. When I pulled into their neighborhood, I parked my reliable, 8-year-old sedan right behind the massive, sleek black luxury SUV that Richard had hired for their airport transfer. When I walked through their front door, the entire house was buzzing with a frantic, almost aggressive kind of energy. You could smell the expensive leather of brand new luggage and the sharp, overpowering scent of Richard's designer cologne. Clara was standing in the hallway, looking completely exhausted before the trip had even begun. She was frantically counting passports, checking her phone, and trying to wipe dog hair off a canvas tote bag that cost more than my first car. And then there was Richard. In my 40 years in the luxury hospitality industry, I learned how to spot the difference between real wealth and fake wealth in about 3 seconds. Real wealth is incredibly quiet. It does not need to announce itself. A man who actually owns the building will walk through the lobby in a plain cotton shirt and comfortable shoes, and he will speak to the staff with quiet respect. But a man who is drowning in debt, desperately trying to look rich, he is the loudest thing in the neighborhood. Richard was dressed in a pristine, light gray linen suit, a custom travel suit. He looked like he was about to step onto a private yacht in the Mediterranean. Not a commercial airliner, with 300 other tired passengers. He was pacing around the foyer, holding a tiny cup of espresso, barking unnecessary orders at the professional driver who was quietly loading their bags into the trunk. Richard stopped when he saw me. He set his espresso cup down on the console table, adjusted his expensive silver watch, and looked at me with this profound, sweeping sense of pity. He walked over and gave me a stiff, patronizing hug. "It really is a shame you could not handle the itinerary, Josephine," Richard said, his voice entirely too loud, making sure the driver outside could hear him. "We are going to be rubbing elbows with some very important people this week. The senior partners are expecting us for dinner on night 1. It is going to be a very fast-paced, high-stress environment, but someone has to stay behind and hold down the fort. Right?" He reached into his pocket and tossed a spare set of house keys onto the table. The metal clinked sharply against the wood. "Make sure you water the imported ferns in the sunroom," he told me, offering that smug, arrogant little smile. I looked at the keys. I looked at the linen suit. I looked at the man who was about to fly across the Pacific Ocean on a discount ticket, entirely unaware that the luxury world he thought he was stepping into had completely locked its doors to him the night before. I did not frown. I did not roll my eyes. I just picked up the keys, slipped them into my pocket, and smiled right back at him. "Have a wonderful time." "Richard," I said softly, "I am sure it will be a trip you never forget." I knelt down and hugged my grandchildren, inhaling the sweet smell of their shampoo. I told them to have fun and to swim every single day. Clara gave me a quick, tight hug. She would not look me in the eye. She was still carrying the heavy guilt of the lie, but she was too relieved to be leaving to actually apologize. I walked them out to the driveway. Richard made a grand, theatrical show of tipping the driver before they even got in the car. He shook the man's hand entirely too hard, looking around the street to make sure the neighbors were watching his family climb into the tinted SUV. The heavy, thick doors of the luxury vehicle slammed shut. The engine gave a low, quiet rumble. I stood in the middle of their driveway, gripping my travel mug with both hands. I felt the comforting warmth of the ceramic seeping into my palms. I watched the black SUV roll slowly down the street, turn the corner at the end of the block, and disappear completely from sight. And then there was just silence. It was a total, absolute silence. It was the quiet of a house of cards right before the wind finally hits it. I stood there for a long time, just breathing in the crisp morning air. I did not feel angry. I did not feel left out. I felt an incredible, profound sense of peace. I got back into my car and drove home. I walked into my quiet house, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat down in my favorite armchair by the window. I looked up at the wall clock. Maui is a very long way from the mainland. It is a 14-hour travel day. I sat in my chair and I thought about those 14 hours. I thought about Richard sitting in his upgraded airline seat, drinking complimentary champagne, adjusting his linen suit. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was spending every second of that flight absolutely intoxicated by his own fake success. He was visualizing walking into the grand lobby of the Opal Coast Resort. He was rehearsing the casual, confident lines he was going to say when he bumped into his wealthy bosses by the infinity pool. He was suspended 30,000 feet in the air, flying toward a concrete wall at 500 miles an hour. And he was smiling the entire way. The trap was completely set. The doors were locked. The VIP flags were gone. All I had to do now was sit in my quiet, comfortable home, drink my coffee, and wait for the impact. It was late in the evening when the phone on my desk finally rang. Because of the massive time difference between the mainland and Hawaii, I had spent the entire day tending to my garden, reading, and simply enjoying the absolute quiet of my house. I knew exactly where they were in the sky at every given moment. I knew when they were over the Pacific. I knew when they were beginning their descent. I picked up the receiver on the second ring. It was Marcus. He was calling me from his private office on the second floor of the Opal Coast Resort, looking directly down through the interior glass wall that overlooked the grand lobby. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back in my leather chair, and I just listened. I told Maya that this is the part of the story I had to piece together through Marcus. But because he and I speak the exact same language of hospitality, I could picture it as clearly as if I were standing right there next to him. Marcus told me that the very first sign of reality hitting Richard happened at the airport in Maui. Richard had walked off that long flight, fully expecting to see a uniformed chauffeur holding an iPad with his name on it, ready to escort his family to a private, air-conditioned black car. Because that is what the VIP flag guarantees, but the VIP flag was gone. So, Richard, wearing his custom linen suit that was now completely wrinkled and smelling of stale airplane air, had to drag his wife, his 2 exhausted children, and 4 massive pieces of heavy designer luggage to the general public taxi stand. He had to wait in line for 45 minutes in the heavy place. Humid tropical heat. By the time their standard, beat-up public minivan taxi pulled up to the sweeping stone driveway of the Opal Coast Resort, Richard was sweating right through his collar. But Marcus said the moment Richard stepped out of the taxi and saw the resort, his posture completely changed. If you have never seen the Opal Coast Resort, it is a masterpiece. The lobby is entirely open air. There are no front doors. You walk across massive slabs of imported black volcanic stone, surrounded by towering indoor waterfalls and thousands of blooming white orchids. You can feel the salt breeze from the ocean the absolute second you arrive. It is designed to make you feel like royalty. Richard left Clara and the children standing by the luggage carts. He did not help them. He completely ignored the standard bellhops. He straightened his wrinkled jacket, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and walked into that spectacular lobby like he owned the entire island. Marcus was watching from above. He had already briefed the front desk staff. Every single employee knew exactly who Richard was, and exactly what they were supposed to do. But before Richard even made it to the polished mahogany check-in counter, he saw exactly what he had come all this way to see. Sitting in the private, sunken lounge area of the lobby, enjoying complimentary champagne, were 3 senior partners from his firm, including David, the man Richard had been so desperate to impress at Thanksgiving. They were dressed in simple, comfortable cotton shirts, looking completely relaxed, radiating that quiet, effortless kind of wealth. Marcus told me that Richard practically sprinted across the lobby. He was running on pure, unadulterated ego. He walked right up to their table, interrupting their private conversation, and loudly announced his arrival. His voice carried across the marble floors. Marcus could hear him perfectly from the second-floor gallery. Richard was performing. He was putting on the show of a lifetime. He shook David's hand, laughing loudly, apologizing for looking a bit tired, claiming his private transfer had gotten mixed up. He stood there, surrounded by his bosses, and he started dropping hints about his reservation. He told David that he was so exhausted from the flight, he could not wait to get the keys to his presidential villa. He actually said the words out loud, making sure the other partners heard him. He talked about how he was looking forward to seeing if the private infinity pool lived up to the brochure. Then, in a move of absolute, breathtaking arrogance, Richard leaned in and told David that he would have his dedicated butler send over a bottle of vintage scotch to their rooms later that evening. He invited all 3 senior partners to come by his villa the next afternoon for a private catered lunch. He was writing checks with his mouth that his bank account could not even begin to cash. David and the partners just smiled politely. They looked at Richard's wrinkled suit. They looked at his exhausted wife, standing near the entrance with the luggage. And they offered him a few very dry, very restrained congratulations on his beautiful accommodations. Richard soaked it all in. He was beaming. He was practically vibrating with triumph. He truly believed he had done it. He had successfully infiltrated the inner circle. He had proven he was one of them. He had left his embarrassing mother-in-law thousands of miles away. And he had ascended to the throne. Marcus said he watched Richard give the partners one final, overly confident wave. Before turning on his heel and marching directly toward the front desk, he bypassed the general check-in line entirely. He walked straight up to the desk, marked specifically for VIP and executive elite members. He leaned against the polished wood, tapped his expensive credit card on the counter, and gave the young woman working the desk a huge, arrogant smile. He had no idea that Marcus was standing directly above him. Watching the exact moment the floor was about to vanish from beneath his feet, Marcus told me that Richard leaned against that polished mahogany counter like he was about to buy the entire resort. He slid his expensive heavy metal credit card across the wood, giving the young receptionist a brilliant, incredibly arrogant smile. He had absolutely no idea that the young woman behind the desk had been personally briefed by the regional director of operations just 10 minutes earlier. She knew exactly who Richard was. She knew exactly what to do. "Good afternoon, Sir," she said. Her voice, a perfect picture of 5-star hospitality. "Welcome to the Opal Coast. May I have the name on the reservation?" "Richard," he announced, projecting his voice so the senior partners sitting in the lounge behind him could hear. "We are checking in. You should have my file flagged for the presidential villa. And please let my dedicated butler know we will need some fresh fruit sent up immediately." The flight was absolutely exhausting. The receptionist did not blink. She did not look flustered. She simply typed his name into the keyboard. She looked at her screen for a few seconds. And then she looked back up at Richard with a polite, professional, and entirely impenetrable smile. "I apologize for the confusion, Sir," she said softly, "but it appears you are standing in the wrong line. This particular desk is reserved exclusively for our executive elite members and our VIP guests. I am going to have to ask you to step over to the general check-in queue in the main lobby." Richard let out a short lace patronizing little laugh. He shook his head, leaning in closer to the desk, acting like he was dealing with an incompetent child. "I think you need to refresh your screen, sweetheart," Richard said, tapping his finger hard on the mahogany wood. "I am a VIP. I have top-tier status. My travel agent secured the presidential villa months ago. Just pull up the executive override." The young woman kept her posture perfectly straight. She did not break eye contact. "I have refreshed your file." "Sit," she replied, her voice remaining perfectly even, but just loud enough to carry. "I am looking at the original booking document. There is no executive override on this account. There is no VIP status attached to your name in our global system. You booked through a third-party discount website." Marcus said he could actually see the blood drain completely out of Richard's face from the second-floor balcony. Richard froze. His hand stopped tapping the counter. He darted a panicked look over his shoulder, checking to see if David and the other senior partners had heard her. They were sitting about 20 feet away, sipping their drinks. But the grand lobby was quiet enough that voices carried over the sound of the indoor waterfalls. Richard turned back to the receptionist, leaning over the counter, his voice dropping to a frantic, angry hiss. "Listen to me," Richard muttered, his neck turning a violent shade of red. "There has been a mistake. A massive system error. You need to fix this right now. I have the villa. I am hosting a private lunch for my firm's managing directors tomorrow afternoon. There is no mistake in the system." "Sir," the receptionist answered calmly, reading directly from the stripped file Marcus had prepared the night before. "You are confirmed for a standard double room in the East Wing, ground floor. Your windows face the employee parking structure. The rate you paid does not include breakfast. It does not include resort credit, and it certainly does not include a butler. You are scheduled to check in at 4 o'clock this afternoon, which means your room is not even ready yet. Now, I must ask you again to please step aside, as you are blocking the executive desk. I told Maya that this is the exact moment where the illusion permanently shatters. This is the moment a man realizes his wooden sword is not going to cut through steel. Instead of accepting the reality, instead of quietly stepping away to call his travel agent or figure out a solution, Richard did exactly what powerless people do when they are backed into a corner. He exploded. He slammed his heavy leather briefcase down on the polished counter. The loud, sharp crack echoed across the entire open-air lobby. Several guests turned their heads. "This is completely unacceptable," Richard shouted, completely abandoning the quiet, refined persona he had been trying to project to his bosses just 3 minutes earlier. "I am not staying in a standard room. I am not looking at a parking lot. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I want to speak to the general manager right this second." He was sweating. His custom linen suit was horribly wrinkled from the flight. His face was twisted in an ugly, desperate rage. He was standing in one of the most exclusive, elegant spaces in the world, throwing a complete temper tantrum over a cheap hotel room. Marcus watched from above as the 3 senior partners at the lounge table slowly put their champagne glasses down. David, the man Richard was so incredibly desperate to impress, stood up slightly. He looked at Richard. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly embarrassed. He looked at Richard the way you look at a complete stranger who is causing a scene in a nice restaurant. David saw the wrinkled suit. He saw Clara standing by the front doors, looking utterly humiliated, surrounded by their heavy DAC, expensive luggage. He heard the receptionist clearly state that Richard had booked a discount room in less than 5 minutes. Richard's entire carefully constructed, heavily financed facade was completely torn to shreds in front of the exact people he needed to believe it the most. He was exposed. He was not a wealthy, connected insider. He was just a loud, financially overextended junior director throwing a fit because his fake lifestyle had finally caught up with him. "Do you know who I am?" Richard screamed at the young woman, his voice cracking with pure panic. "I will have your job for this. I will have this entire front desk fired. Get me the manager." He was demanding a manager, He wanted someone with authority to come out and validate his lies. He wanted someone to apologize to him, to bow down to him, to hand him the keys to a kingdom he had never earned. He had absolutely no idea that he was about to get exactly what he asked for. I told Maya that you have to picture the absolute spectacle of that moment. The grand lobby of the Opal Coast Resort is designed to be a place of total serenity. You have the gentle sound of the indoor waterfalls. You have the soft Hawaiian music playing in the background. You have the quiet murmur of wealthy guests enjoying their complimentary champagne. And right in the middle of all of that elegance, you had Richard, standing at the polished mahogany counter, his face bright red, his linen suit wrinkled and sticking to his back with sweat, screaming at a 20-something receptionist about how important he was. He was demanding a manager. He was practically vibrating with rage. And Marcus delivered exactly what he asked for. Marcus told me he walked out of his private office on the second floor and slowly descended the grand sweeping staircase into the lobby. He did not rush. He did not look worried. He walked with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who actually runs the island. Marcus was dressed in an impeccable, custom-tailored dark suit. Every single hair was perfectly in place. The complete, absolute opposite of Richard's frantic, desperate energy. When Marcus reached the front desk, the young receptionist immediately took a step back, deferring to him. Richard slammed his hand on the counter again, pointing a finger directly at Marcus. "Are you the general manager?" Richard demanded, his voice echoing off the volcanic stone walls. "Because your staff is completely incompetent. I have a VIP reservation for the presidential villa. I am a top-tier guest. I am hosting a private lunch for the senior partners of my financial firm tomorrow. And this girl is telling me I am booked in a standard room facing a parking lot. You need to fix this right now, or I am calling corporate." Marcus did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his hands on the polished mahogany counter and offered Richard a completely serene, utterly professional smile. "Good afternoon, Sir," Marcus said, his voice deep and perfectly calm. "I am Marcus, the regional director of operations for this entire island chain. I assure you, my staff is highly competent, and our global system does not make errors of this magnitude." Richard puffed out his chest, trying to look intimidating. "Then look at the screen," he snapped. "Look at the executive override. My travel agent secured it months ago." Marcus did not look at the screen. He did not need to. He kept his eyes locked perfectly onto Richard's sweating, frantic face. "I have personally reviewed your file, Sir," Marcus replied, "and I can explain exactly what happened to your accommodations." The lobby had gone incredibly quiet. Marcus told me that David and the other two senior partners sitting in the lounge area had stopped talking completely. They were watching the entire interaction unfold. "You see, Sir," Marcus continued, projecting his voice just enough to ensure the men in the lounge could hear every single word. "The presidential villa, the dedicated butler service, the priority cabana access, and the complimentary food and beverage tags were not secured by your travel agent, and they certainly were not secured by any elite status attached to your personal name." Richard frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant rage. "Then who put them on my file?" he demanded. Marcus let a single, heavy second of silence pass. "Those privileges," Marcus said, his voice ringing with absolute clarity, "were a complimentary gift. They were applied to your reservation 3 weeks ago through the direct lifetime executive override of our former global hospitality consultant, Mrs. Josephine Pemberley." Marcus told me he actually watched Richard stop breathing. It was a physical reaction. Richard's mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no sound came out. His hand, which had been tapping angrily on the counter just a second before, froze completely still. The color drained out of his face so fast he actually looked sick. "Josephine," Richard whispered. The name barely made it past his lips. "Yes, Mrs. Pemberley," Marcus confirmed politely. "She is a highly revered figure within this corporation. She personally requested that your family be moved from the standard, heavily discounted ground floor room that you originally purchased, up to our most exclusive cliffside estate." It was a remarkably generous gesture. Richard just stared at him. The entire fake reality he had built, the entire illusion of his massive success, his power, his influence, was collapsing straight down onto his head in the middle of a marble lobby. But Marcus was not finished. However, Marcus continued, his tone shifting into cold, corporate finality. "As I am sure you can understand, our lifetime executive privileges are strictly non-transferable unless the executive member is physically present on the property. When our system flagged that Mrs. Pemberley did not board her flight this morning, hotel policy mandated that we immediately revoke all associated VIP services." Richard was completely paralyzed. He could not scream anymore. He could not threaten anyone's job. "Since Mrs. Pemberley is not here," Marcus concluded, "you are responsible for the exact reservation you paid for with your own funds. A standard double room. No breakfast. No pool privileges. Now, if you would kindly hand my receptionist a credit card to cover the standard deposit for incidentals, we can hand you your room keys." Marcus told me that the silence that followed was the most pathetic thing he had ever witnessed in his 40 years in the industry. Richard slowly turned his head. He looked over his shoulder, toward the sunken lounge. David was looking right back at him, the senior partner of the firm, the man Richard had bragged to, the man he had invited to a private catered lunch at a villa he did not own. David looked at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity and profound embarrassment. Richard had been completely exposed as a fraud, a man who was flying his family across the ocean on discount tickets, trying to play a billionaire using his mother-in-law's name, only to be publicly stripped of everything the second she decided to stop carrying him. With shaking hands, Richard reached into his wrinkled linen jacket. He pulled out a credit card and quietly handed it to the receptionist. He did not say another word. He just stood there, looking at the polished mahogany wood, a completely broken, humiliated man. I stopped talking and took a slow sip of my tea. Maya was sitting across from me in the conservatory, completely speechless. Her eyes were wide, taking in the absolute, surgical precision of the dismantling. She whispered that it was the most brilliant, terrifying thing she had ever heard. She asked me what happened next. She wanted to know what Richard did when he finally had to face me. I smiled, setting my teacup down on the saucer. I told her that a man like Richard does not face you when he is beaten. He runs, and then he calls you from the dark. The afternoon sun had finally started to lower, casting long, warm, golden shadows across the woven rug of my conservatory. The air in the room was incredibly still, smelling faintly of damp earth and the citrus tea we had been drinking for the last hour. Maya was sitting across the small oak table, completely quiet. She was 25 years old, still young enough to believe that every battle required a raised voice and a clenched fist. She had spent the last hour listening to me systematically dismantle the ego of a man who had tried to erase me, and I could see the wheels turning behind her dark eyes. She looked at me, her hands wrapped tightly around her porcelain cup. "Were you happy?" Maya asked. her voice dropping to a soft, almost hesitant whisper. "When Marcus told you what happened in the lobby, when you knew Richard was standing there, completely humiliated in front of the exact people he was so desperate to impress, did you feel vindicated? Did you sit here in your house and gloat?" I looked at my grandniece. I looked at the fierce, protective anger she was carrying for me. I took a slow breath, and I told her the absolute truth. I told her, no, I did not feel a single ounce of joy. I did not feel vindicated. I did not pour myself a glass of champagne to celebrate. When you spend 40 years in the business of rebuilding massive luxury properties, you learn a very hard, very undeniable truth. Demolition is never pretty. Tearing down a rotting wall creates thick dust. It makes a terrible mess. It is loud, and it is unpleasant, and it temporarily ruins the environment around it. But it is entirely, absolutely necessary if you want the building to remain standing for another 50 years. I told Maya that I thought about my daughter. I thought about Clara standing in that open-air lobby, exhausted from a 14-hour flight, surrounded by heavy designer luggage she knew they could not afford. I thought about the sheer, crushing humiliation she must have felt watching her husband shrink into a pathetic, frantic shell of a man. I thought about my 2 young grandchildren, tired and confused, waiting for a magical vacation that simply did not exist. That was the collateral damage. And sitting in my quiet house thousands of miles away, knowing my family was experiencing that, absolutely broke my heart. But I looked Maya directly in the eye, and I told her that a rotting tree has to be pulled up by the roots. You cannot just paint over the dead leaves and pretend the soil is healthy. You cannot water a diseased plant and expect it to bear sweet fruit. Clara needed to see exactly who she was married to. She had spent years enabling his behavior, covering up his financial panic, and participating in his cruel little lies because it was easier than facing the terrifying reality of her own life. She needed the glossy facade to shatter so completely, so publicly, that Richard could never, ever glue it back together. I did not do it to punish them. I did it to save them. Maya leaned back in her chair. She looked at the blooming orchids lining the glass walls. She was finally beginning to understand the profound difference between throwing a tantrum and executing a boundary. She asked me what happened next. She asked if Richard called me right away to apologize. She assumed that a man who had just been so thoroughly destroyed would immediately pick up the phone and beg for forgiveness. I laughed softly. It was a dry, hollow sound that barely disturbed the quiet of the room. I told her that men like Richard do not apologize when they are exposed. They run, they hide, they panic. For the first 2 days of that vacation, I heard absolutely nothing from my family. It was a complete and utter silence. But through Marcus, I knew exactly what was happening on the island. Marcus called me on the evening of their second day. He told me that Richard had dragged his family to that small, ground floor room facing the concrete parking structure. He told me that Richard had spent the first 48 hours desperately trying to avoid David and the senior partners. Richard stopped wearing the custom linen suits. He stopped parading around the grand lobby. He completely stopped trying to perform. Marcus told me that Richard had tried to take Clara to the resort's signature oceanfront restaurant on their first night, hoping to salvage some small piece of the luxury he had promised her. But because his file had been completely stripped of my executive override, he was informed by the hostess that the restaurant was fully booked for the next 6 months. And only VIP, priority guests could bypass the waiting list. Richard, the man who had bragged about pulling strings and commanding respect, had to pack his exhausted family into a standard public taxi and take them to a cheap local diner down the highway. He was trapped. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, on an island, thousands of miles from his home, with absolutely no way to fake his way out of it. He could not put it on a credit card. He could not bully a receptionist. He could not lie his way into a better view. I told Maya that silence is a remarkably heavy thing when you are entirely out of options. Richard spent 2 days suffocating under the weight of his own absolute powerlessness. He had to wake up every morning and look at the concrete wall outside his window, knowing that paradise was just on the other side of the property. And the only reason he was not sitting in it was because he had chosen to be cruel to the woman who owned the keys. I poured the last of the tea into Maya's cup. I told her that I knew the phone call was coming. I knew he was going to break. It was just a matter of waiting for the silence to become too deafening for him to endure. And on the morning of the 3rd day, my phone finally rang. The phone rang at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning on the 3rd day of their trip. I was standing at my kitchen sink, washing a single ceramic coffee mug. The morning sun was pouring through the window, catching the dust motes in the air. The house was perfectly en off, absolutely still. When the sharp ring of the landline cut through the quiet, I did not jump. I simply turned the water off, dried my hands on a cotton towel, and walked over to the counter. I looked at the caller ID display. It was not Clara. It was Richard. I told Maya that I let it ring 3 times. I wanted him to wait. I wanted him to sit in whatever miserable reality he was currently occupying and listen to that ringing, wondering if the woman he had so casually discarded was even going to pick up the phone. On the 4th ring, I lifted the receiver. I brought it to my ear. I did not say hello. I did not offer a greeting. I just breathed into the receiver and waited. For the first 5 seconds, there was nothing but heavy, static-filled silence on the other end of the line. And then I heard a sound that I had never, in the 5 years I had known him, ever heard Richard make. I heard a ragged, completely broken gasp. He was crying. He was not just shedding a few quiet tears. The man on the other end of the telephone was sobbing. It was the ugly, desperate, uncontrollable crying of a person whose entire universe has just collapsed inward, crushing them under the weight of their own lies. Josephine. Richard choked out. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was high, tight, and trembling violently. Josephine, please do not hang up. I leaned against the granite counter. I looked out the window at my garden. I am listening. Richard, I said softly. What followed was a 10-minute avalanche of absolute, unadulterated truth. It was as if the dam had completely broken, and every single insecurity, every financial panic, every pathetic lie he had ever told was suddenly flooding out of him. He told me about the lobby. He told me how David, the senior partner he worshipped, had looked at him with sheer disgust. He told me that David had actually walked past him at the public pool the day before and completely ignored him, pretending they did not even know each other. He told me about the room, the ground floor, heavily discounted room facing the concrete parking structure. He said the air conditioning unit rattled so loudly that Clara had not slept in 2 days. He said my grandchildren were crying because they were cramped in a tiny space, and because he could not afford to buy them food at the resort restaurants without the complimentary tags. I had secretly arranged. We ate dinner at a fast food drive-thru last night. Josephine. Richard sobbed, the humiliation practically radiating through the phone. I had to walk a mile down the highway in the humidity to bring back a cardboard box of cheap burgers because my credit card was declined at the hotel cafe. My card was declined. The front desk clerk looked right at me and handed it back. He was completely shattered. The custom linen suits, the expensive bourbon, the loud, arrogant bragging in my living room. All of it was gone, stripped away by a single system update. And then, the real confession started. He admitted that his entire life was a carefully constructed fraud. He told me that he was drowning in debt. He said his leased European sedan was 2 months behind on payments. He confessed that the new house they had bought was entirely out of their budget, and he was terrified of losing his job because he was not actually as successful as he pretended to be. I just wanted them to see me. Richard cried, his breath hitching. I wanted the senior partners to see me as one of them. I thought if I brought them here, if I showed them I could afford the presidential villa, they would finally respect me. I thought they would make me a full partner. I listened to him. I did not interrupt. I just let the silence stretch over the thousands of miles of ocean between us. I am so sorry, Richard whispered. The arrogance was completely burned out of him, leaving nothing but ash. I am so incredibly sorry. Josephine, about the plane tickets, about leaving you behind, about the way I spoke to you at Thanksgiving. I wanted to make you feel small so I could feel big. I was so jealous of how quiet you are, how you do not need to prove anything to anyone. I hated it because I have to prove myself every single second of every single day. And I am failing. He was begging for forgiveness. He was standing in a cheap, dark hotel room, his fake kingdom completely destroyed, asking the woman he had treated like a peasant to somehow grant him absolution. Maya was leaning forward in the conservatory, her eyes completely locked onto me. She asked what I did. She asked if I yelled at him then. She asked if I told him he got exactly what he deserved. I took a slow sip of my tea. I looked at my grandniece. I told her that kicking a man when he is completely down is a waste of energy. When a building has already been demolished, you do not need to stand in the rubble and scream at the broken bricks. I did not raise my voice. I told Maya. I did not gloat. I did not tell him I told you so. I realized, standing in my sunlit kitchen, listening to my son-in-law weep into the telephone, that the punishment was already complete. The false reality was dead. Clara had seen the truth. Richard had been forced to look in the mirror, and he was terrified of the man looking back at him. The boundary had been successfully, permanently drawn in absolute titanium. But drawing a boundary is only the first half of the equation. The second half is deciding what you are going to do with the people standing on the other side of it. I took a deep breath. I let Richard finish crying. I let the silence settle between us one last time. And then, I spoke. I stood in my sunlit kitchen, listening to the jagged, heavy sound of my son-in-law trying to catch his breath on the other side of the world. He was completely silent now, waiting for my judgment. He was waiting for me to scream at him. He was waiting for me to list every single terrible thing he had done, to rub his face in the absolute misery of his situation, to tell him he was a failure. I did not do any of those things. I let the quiet stretch out for a long, heavy moment. I listened to the faint hum of my refrigerator. I looked at the dust motes dancing in the morning light. Richard, I said softly. He let out a shaky breath. Yes, I am here. I want you to listen to me very carefully. I told him, keeping my voice completely even, entirely devoid of any anger. I am not going to yell at you. I am not going to demand that you pay me back for the disrespect you showed me in my own home. Because the truth is, Richard, I am not angry with you. I am just incredibly sad for you. I heard him swallow hard over the phone line. You went to such extreme, exhausting lengths to push me out of your life. I continued. You lied to my face. You made my daughter complicit in your lie. You tried to make me feel small, entirely unvalued, and completely disposable. And you did it all because you were terrified. He did not argue. He did not try to defend himself. He just listened. You thought leaving me behind would somehow elevate you. I told him, you thought if you could just get to that island, if you could just step into that luxury villa, you would finally become the man you have been pretending to be for the last 5 years. But I need you to understand something right now, and I need you to remember it for the rest of your life. I leaned closer to the phone. I have never needed a plane ticket to feel like I belonged in this family. Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, absolute Register. I know exactly who I am. I know exactly what I have built. You are the only one who needed a ticket to prove yourself to the outside world. You are the one who needed a piece of paper and a room key to feel like you mattered. The line was completely silent. He was crying again. But it was quiet now. It was the soft, defeated sound of a man who has finally stopped running from his own shadow. I did not take that villa away from you to be cruel. I explained. I took it away because you were building a kingdom on top of a quicksand foundation. And you were dragging my daughter and my grandchildren down into it with you. You needed to hit the absolute bottom. Richard, you needed the entire facade to shatter, so you could finally see that you have absolutely nothing holding you up except debt and lies. He sniffled. His voice was incredibly small when he finally spoke. What do I do? Josephine, he whispered. Clara will barely look at me. The kids are miserable. Do I call the airline? Do I put more money on the credit card and fly us home early? I just want to go home. I closed my eyes for a second. No, I told him firmly. You are not going to run away from this. You are not going to put another single dime on a credit card you cannot pay off. You are going to stay exactly where you are. He let out a confused, panicked breath. You are going to stay in that room for the next 4 days. I instructed him, you are going to wake up every morning and you are going to look out that window at the concrete parking structure. You are going to look at the exhausted face of your wife. You are going to sit in the absolute reality of what your lies have bought your family. You are going to sit in it until it changes you. I paused, letting the weight of the consequence settle over him. But, I added softly, when you fly back on Sunday, you are not going to go to your empty house. You are going to drive your family directly here from the airport. I will have a roast in the oven. We are going to sit down at my dining table. And we are going to have a family dinner. Richard gasped. It was a sharp, sudden intake of air. He was completely stunned. He had expected me to banish him. He had expected me to tell him I never wanted to see his face again. He had prepared himself for a war. And instead, I had completely disarmed him by offering him a chair at my table. You are inviting me into your home? He asked, his voice trembling with sheer disbelief. You are the father of my grandchildren. Richard, I said simply, you are my family. I am not going to erase your name from the table just because you tried to erase mine. But understand this. When you walk through my front door on Sunday, the performance is over. The fake suits, the bragging, the lies. You leave them on the porch, or you do not walk in at all. I understand. He wept. The relief in his voice so profound, it was almost difficult to listen to. I promise you. Josephine, I understand. Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you. I told him to go apologize to his wife. I gently hung up the receiver, setting it back on its cradle. The sharp click echoed in the quiet kitchen. I looked across the small oak table in the conservatory. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the woven rug. Maya was staring at me. Her teacup was entirely forgotten. She had spent the last hour angry on my behalf. She had wanted vengeance. She had wanted to hear a story about a screaming match and a dramatic, fiery destruction. But as she sat there, processing the end of that phone call, I watched a very quiet, very profound realization wash over her young face. She finally understood what I had been trying to teach her since she first sat down crying over her stolen project at work. She realized that destroying a person when they are completely defenseless on the ground does not make you powerful. It just makes you a bully. True, absolute power is the ability to dismantle someone's entire fake reality. Watch them fall to their knees, and then calmly hand them the exact blueprint they need to rebuild themselves. On your terms. Forgiveness is not weakness, I told Maya, watching her eyes widen. Forgiveness does not mean you erase the boundary. It just means the boundary finally worked. Sunday evening arrived with a quiet, steady rain washing over the neighborhood. I spent the afternoon in my kitchen. I roasted a chicken with rosemary and garlic. I baked fresh bread. I set the large oak dining table, but I did not bring out the imported crystal or the heavy silver chargers that Richard always obsessed over. I used my everyday ceramic plates and plain cotton napkins. I wanted to make it absolutely clear that there was no performance happening in my home tonight. There was only reality. At exactly 6 o'clock, I heard the sound of tires pulling into my driveway. I did not go to the window. I simply stood by the kitchen island, wiping my hands on a towel, and waited. The front door opened. I heard the frantic, happy footsteps of my 2 grandchildren running down the hallway. They burst into the kitchen, throwing their arms around my waist, smelling of airplane, cabin, air, and tired children. I hugged them tightly, breathing them in, feeling that deep, profound ache in my chest finally settle. Then, Clara walked into the room. My daughter looked completely exhausted. The forced, glossy perfection she always tried to maintain was entirely gone. She was wearing sweatpants and an oversized college sweater. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a heavy, unspoken apology, and she just walked over and buried her face in my shoulder. She cried quietly for a moment, and I just held her. I did not need her to say the words. The breaking of the illusion was apology enough. And then, Richard stepped into the kitchen. I looked at my son-in-law. The transformation was absolute. The custom linen suits were gone. The heavy, expensive silver watch was not on his wrist. He was wearing a plain, slightly faded cotton sweater and comfortable jeans. But the biggest change was his posture. He was not puffing his chest out. He was not looking down his nose at my kitchen. He looked incredibly small. And for the first time since the day I met him, he looked entirely genuine. He stopped a few feet away from me. He looked at the ceramic plates set on the table. He smelled the roasted chicken. He looked at me, and his eyes immediately filled with tears. "Josephine," Richard whispered, his voice trembling just a little. "Thank you. Thank you for having us." I offered him a warm, soft smile. "Welcome home. Richard, go wash your hands. Dinner is almost ready." That Sunday dinner was the quietest meal we had ever shared. There was no loud bragging about business deals. There was no desperate name-dropping of senior partners. There were no cell phones allowed on the table. We just sat together, listening to the rain hit the windows, talking about the children and the school year ahead. When dinner was over, Richard did not go sit in the living room while the women cleaned up. He stood up, silently gathered the empty plates, carried them to the sink, and started washing them by hand. I watched him standing at my sink, his sleeves rolled up, scrubbing a roasting pan. The arrogant, terrified man who had tried to erase me was completely gone. In his place was just a father, finally learning how to stand on solid ground. I looked back at Maya. The sun had completely set outside the conservatory glass. The room was dark, illuminated only by the small brass lamp on the table between us. Our tea had gone completely cold. Maya was looking at me with a profound sense of awe. She had stopped crying over her own stolen project hours ago. She was sitting up straight, her shoulders relaxed, absorbing the absolute weight of the story. "You forgave him," Maya said softly. "After everything he did, you just let him back in." I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. "I did." I told her, because holding on to anger is just drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. But you have to understand the difference between forgiveness and surrender. Maya. I looked deep into my grandniece's eyes, making sure she heard every single word of this final lesson. Forgiveness does not erase a boundary, I said quietly. It does not mean you forget what a person is capable of. Forgiveness only means something when both sides have learned a lesson. I forgave Richard because he finally learned that he cannot survive in a world built on lies. And he learned that my silence is not weakness. It is absolute control. I leaned back in my chair. "When you go back to your architectural firm on Monday," I told her, "you are not going to scream at your director. You are not going to cry. You are going to quietly document every single piece of that project that you built. You are going to build an undeniable fortress of proof. And then, you are going to wait for the exact moment they try to present it without you. And you are going to pull the floor right out from under them." A slow, brilliant, entirely confident smile spread across Maya's face. She finally understood. True power does not make a sound until the trap is already sprung. Thank you for sitting down and sharing this time with me today. If you believe that respect is something that must be earned rather than demanded, take a moment to subscribe and join this community. There is always another story waiting for you.